Webinar titled Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions, the Role of Indigenous Peoples in Implementing Sustainable Development Goal 16. This exciting event is brought to you by the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in New York. Thank you for being with us this evening. My name is Andrew Lee, and I have the pleasure of serving as moderator for this webinar, which will explore a range of issues pertaining to the role that Indigenous peoples have and will play in improving the state of the world, and in particular, the Sustainable Development Goal number 16. That goal, number 16, seeks to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions. As context for this webinar, it's important to understand why this topic is so significant. Let me provide you with 3 facts that will help frame the discussion this evening. The first, Indigenous peoples comprise about 6% of the world's population, which is about 370 million people who belong to more than 5,000 different Indigenous groups. Number 2, Indigenous nations and communities are responsible for managing approximately 80% of the globe's biodiversity. That's right, 80% of the globe's biodiversity. And number 3, Indigenous peoples are incredibly diverse, and there are thousands of unique Indigenous cultures, worldviews, languages, religions, and governmental forms. This evening, we're pleased to showcase an impressive set of speakers and luminaries, including His Excellency James Lee, Director General of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in New York, the Honorable Calivat Gadu, Deputy Minister of the Council of Indigenous Peoples for Taiwan, Chief Wilton Littlechild, former Grand Chief of the Confederacy of Treaty 6 First Nations and former member of Canadian Parliament. Following remarks from each of these outstanding individuals, we'll have a lively conversation with 4 leading thinkers and doers in the sphere of Indigenous rights. They include Professor Angela Riley from the University of California in Los Angeles, Professor Claire Charters from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, Dr. Debby Lin from the Makapahi Culture Association of the Amish Tribe in Taiwan, and Mr. Victor Lopez Carmen, who's the co-chair of Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. I will formally introduce them later in the program. So let's dive right into it. I am pleased to introduce His Excellency James Lee, Director General of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in New York. Ambassador Lee has served in this role since July 2020. And immediately prior to this role, Ambassador Lee was Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he has also represented Taiwan in a variety of posts around the world, including the Netherlands and the Czech Republic. As head of UN Affairs Task Force, Ambassador Lee has been an active participant in global dialogue about Indigenous peoples, and we're fortunate to have him provide some welcoming remarks for this evening's event. Ambassador Lee.
Thank you, Andrew, for your kind introduction. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you all for joining us. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Deputy Minister Calivat Gadu, Dr. Littlechild, Mr. Lee, Professor Riley, Professor Charters, Dr. Lin, and Mr. Lopez Carmen for accepting our invitation to share your insights. Your generous support for this seminar demonstrate our shared commitment to Indigenous issues. Our speaker not only advised the UN on issues related to Indigenous people, but have also been long-term advocates of Indigenous rights throughout their careers. I'm confident that our seminar will foster meaningful discussion, given their extensive experience and expertise. 2020 was a very challenging year for all of us due to the COVID-19 pandemic. As vaccines become more widely available in different parts of the world, Hope is on the horizon for many. However, even as we attempt to move past this difficult time, we must not lose sight of the challenges that Indigenous people continue to face. On the note, this pandemic highlights pre-existing inequality, inequities, and historical injustice impacting the Indigenous communities, especially in regard to various rights enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. At the same time, the public has also paid increased attention to Indigenous peoples' traditional practice. We can also see how Indigenous communities and institutions have used their ancestral knowledge to help respond to the pandemic at a time when national health systems are often spread thin. Enabling Indigenous peoples' participation in the decision-making process is essential for establishing a more inclusive society and may help expedite the realization of the UN Sustainable Development Goal. This is why this year's United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues offers the world a great opportunity to not only reflect, but also move forward. In Taiwan, Her Excellency President Tsai Ing-wen, on behalf of the government, officially apologized to Taiwan's indigenous people on August 1st, 2016, for their suffering over the last 400 years. This apology sent a clear and powerful message that Taiwan is committed to advancing indigenous rights. My government has spared no effort in taking concrete actions to include indigenous people in the policymaking process by establishing the Presidential Office, Indigenous Historical and Transitional Justice Committee, which serve as an equal platform for communication between the government and indigenous representatives. I look forward to hearing Dr. Calivat Gadu's insight into the committee. Lastly, I would like to thank the Council of Indigenous People for inviting Indigenous kindergartner from New Taipei City's Danfeng Elementary School, known for its urban immersion program on Indigenous language and culture, to share their progress in revitalizing Indigenous language. We look forward to their performance, and we deeply believe all Indigenous kids, both those living in tribal and urban areas, deserve access to quality Indigenous language and culture education. Thank you again to all our participants, and I hope that you all enjoy the event. Thank you.
So thank you very much for those inspiring words, Ambassador Lee, and for sharing that beautiful video presentation. It's now my great honor to introduce this evening's keynote speaker, the Honorable Calivat Gadu, who is the Deputy Minister of Taiwan's Council of Indigenous Peoples. Deputy Minister Gadu is of the Paiwan people, an indigenous population of Taiwan who number nearly 100,000 people. He is an ethnologist by training, and he holds both a master's and PhD in ethnology from the National Tsinghua University, which is a leading research university based in Taipei. Deputy Minister Gadu has held numerous leadership positions within the Executive Yuan's Council of Indigenous Peoples, including Director General of the Department of Education and Culture, Director General of the Department of Planning, and Head of the Parliamentary Liaison Unit. Thank you, Deputy Minister, for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Andrew. Ambassador James Lee from Taipei, New York. Speakers from around the world, ladies and gentlemen, good day. Java Masaru Mapulat, Dianti Salibata Lagadu Masimasani, Taiwan. I'm greeting everyone in my mother tongue, the Paiwan language. My name is Calivat Gadu from Taiwan. Before my presentation, I would like to share with you a 3-minute video of the achievements we made in the past years.
我们不敢忘记这个岛上先来后到的顺序。
We have the chance to speak our indigenous languages loudly. How happy it is. We cannot speak the language familiar to us. This has been the common experience of middle-aged Taiwanese people.
其实真正最该学习的是学生的家长，因为现在跟我同年龄层的家长会说母语的真的寥寥可数。对，所以如果父母亲都愿意讲了，孩子他就跟着去学。
Many indigenous languages are laden with wisdom and experiences of everyday life. As elders pass away, indigenous cultures and languages will fade gradually. When the language is lost, we lose a perspective on life and the records of past experiences of living. Seniors lack interlocutors, and young indigenous people will lose the chance to learn the life experience of the elders. The loss of the indigenous language will be a heavy and sustaining setback to the vigorousness of indigenous culture.
台湾原住民族在这么长的时间遭受到了很多的层面的这个剥夺，这些部分当然要予以回正所以这个原长会就这样成立了由很多的学者专家担任召集人所组成的工作小组，包括土地、语言、历史、文化，还有和解的5个小组所以这是一个难得的机会，要厘清过去的不公不义的真相。
The passing of the Indigenous Languages Development Act will regard indigenous languages as national languages. Now, local governments and indigenous areas can disperse government documents in indigenous languages.
我们这边很多老人家是看不懂那个汉字的，有时候他们公文收到了，他也不晓得是做什么，他就放在一边，要用族语。那他们看了以后会更清楚，更知道那个公文的那个主旨在哪里，而且会比较亲切这针对我们族人会比较清楚它的内容，它的意思是什么，那他们的那个出席的意愿就会比较高。
The transformational justice for indigenous peoples will work towards truth, reconciliation, and living together harmoniously for a sustainable future.
我要代表政府向全体原住民族致上我们最深的歉意。对于过去400年来各位承受的苦痛和不公平的待遇，我代表政府向各位道歉。
Today, I'm very happy to have this chance to share with you our progress on historical justice and transitional justice for indigenous peoples in Taiwan. I also want to thank Taipei, New York, from this opportunity to talk about Taiwan's experience with the international community. There are three parts to my presentation today. First, why did the president apologize? Second, what's in the apology? Third, the real effects of the apology. To talk about Taiwan's efforts in historical justice and international transitional justice for indigenous peoples, we must start with the president's apology. This apology was deeply inspired by the international community. Apologies to indigenous peoples were made in the US, New Zealand, Norway, Australia, and Canada, all of which influenced the development of indigenous peoples' rights in Taiwan. As President Tsai says, to resolve long-standing issues, we must face the root of the problems, that is, the persecution and the inequality caused by history. In her campaign, President Tsai called for an official government apology to indigenous peoples to solve the misunderstandings between ethnic groups and further bring about reconciliation and a common future. As soon as she took office in 2016, she kept up her promise to making an official apology to indigenous peoples. She is also the first leader to do this in Asia. So, why did the president apologize? President Tsai apologized for the oppression that our people suffered, for the rights and the property that were taken, and the violation of indigenous rights to culture, language, education, identity, land, and justice. Compared with apologies made in other countries, President Tsai took a comprehensive approach by reflecting on all policies and apologizing for each specific incident. One apology cannot make right centuries of suffering that our people and ancestors have endured. However, this apology does open the door to reconciliation in this country. As President Tsai says, only by facing the truth sincerely can reconciliation be attained. This apology is only the beginning. On this slide, you can see the 8 commitments that President Tsai made in addition to the apology. We exactly has the government's done in the past 3 years besides apology? First, language. Language is what defines indigenous peoples. Within 1 year of President Tsai taking office, the Indigenous Languages Act was enacted. The act officially makes indigenous languages national languages. This act is also the first of its kind in Asia. Following this, legislation for the development of National Language Act was also completed in 2019. That same year, the government amended the Education Act for indigenous peoples to lay down a solid foundation for development and the passing on of indigenous languages. The third achievement is setting up the indigenous point of view in history. The history of indigenous peoples is often through the eyes of the embodiment, of the dominant, without regard for the indigenous view. Therefore, published a series of historical research and findings. By publishing the books on major historic events of indigenous peoples, we take back control of telling our own history and retrieve justice. The publication will serve other purposes. Taiwan's Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Education will work together to use this as material for education curriculum. The publications will also be used as reference in putting up monuments from the indigenous people's perspective. The fourth achievement is about land justice. As our name, Indigenous Peoples in Mandarin implies, we are the original owners of this land, but the land issues are very wide-ranging. So we took a more divergent approach to legislation. For example, we canceled the 5-year waiting period of obtained rights to land used by indigenous peoples. We also amended the law on compensation for logging bans to increase the compensation. These efforts all help to restore land justice. The fifth achievement is investigation on the nuclear waste on Orchid Island. 46 years ago, Taiwan's government stored nuclear waste on indigenous people's land without our knowledge. After the president's apology and the joint efforts across ministries, the fact-finding report is now completed. Last year, President Tsai personally traveled to the Orchid Island and the purpose of compensation of $89 million and another $700,000 every 3 years thereafter. A foundation will also be set up to follow up on compensation efforts. The sixth major achievement is a three-party talks regarding a mining ground of Agile Cement Corporation. In 1973, this mine was set up in the traditional territory of indigenous peoples, and it caused the local indigenous protest to reclaim the land. The protests have continued to this day. Almost half a century later, and under the president's orders, talks are finally happening. The government, private company, and the local people were all brought to the table. A lot of progress has been made, and the fact-finding report will soon be finished. I want to point out that because of language, because of the Indigenous Justice Committee, ACC took the initiative in the consultation process. This shows that justice are taken root in our society. In conclusion, we will continue our efforts to restore indigenous rights. We will also continue to engage with the international community to make sure we are following the UNTRIP under the SDGs of the United Nations in the right. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you. Mali mali.
We appreciate your remarks, Deputy Minister Gadu. Thank you for sharing your insights in this important overview of the Indigenous experience in Taiwan. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Chief Wilton Littlechild, an internationally renowned Indigenous leader who will provide us with some powerful words. Among other things, Chief Littlechild is a Cree chief, a lawyer, a Hall of Fame hockey player, a former member of Canadian Parliament and leader with Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and a key member of the 1977 Indigenous delegation to the United Nations. But perhaps the highest compliment I can give Chief Littlechild is the title of Trusted Elder. 2 words that mean everything to Indigenous peoples everywhere. And as our trusted elder, Chief Littlechild will share some wisdom with us, for which we are most grateful. I want to add, before I turn it over to you, Chief, that it may be a little bit difficult for our audience to hear you because you're in a remote location, but I can tell our audience that if you listen carefully, you'll hear powerful words from a great leader. So, Chief, I'll turn it over to you.
Kanse. Kansen totemak. Igan naskomaukse manto. Soemgoyak stahe semi nanos. Meikan mu teonia maskoti sikoche. Greetings, my Cree language, to all your excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. A special acknowledgement to all the elders and the youth. A tribute to all the traditional territories from which are participating in this virtual seminar. Thank you to our host. I'm asked also to clarify, I'm no longer Grand Chief, but been asked to be a helper, to be a fire starter. As you know, fire is one of the sacred elements of life, key to many of our celebrations, for which grateful. I want to refer back to where we started our journey with a quote. Treaties between sovereign nations explicitly entail agreements which represent the supreme law of the land, binding each party to an inviolate international relationship. That was a declaration made in 1974, where I first came involved in this international journey. Thank you, Andrew, for your kind words. Introduction. I want to also refer to the United Nations Declaration, Article 18, which states, Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which will affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures, as well as to maintain, develop their own Indigenous decision-making institutions. There I would underscore the word institutions, because it's a part of the overall presentation. UN Permanent Forum this week is their theme. In 2012, at a World Conference, Sustainable Development, from the conference, I quote, "We stress the importance of the participation of Indigenous peoples in the achievement of sustainable development. We also recognize the importance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the context of global, regional, national, and subnational implementation of sustainable development strategies." That was from the World Conference on Sustainable Development called Future We Want. Also from the World Conference Outcome Document, the paragraph 37, which states, and I quote, "We note that Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to development. In this regard, we commit ourselves to giving due consideration to all the rights of Indigenous peoples in the elaboration of the post-2015 development agenda." Of course, as you all know, that was previous. agenda. The indigenous peoples for this Sustainable Development Goals advocated for a rights-based approach based on the minimum standards, the UN Declaration, full participation. Secondly, free, prior, and informed consent, affirmed in all stages: planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. Thirdly, protections for land and resource rights, traditional livelihoods, knowledge and food sovereignty. Culture is the fourth pillar of sustainable development. The 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, as you know, consists of 17 goals and 169 targets, which 92% linked to human rights. 73 of the 169 Sustainable Development Goals have substantial links to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples or to the ILO Convention for 169 on Indigenous Tribal Peoples' Rights. So, 2030 Agenda, Transforming Our World, adopted by the UN General Assembly in September 2015, includes 6 mentions of indigenous peoples: empowerment, engagement, education of indigenous peoples. Secondly, ending hunger through sustainable agriculture, targets 2.3. Ensuring access to education for indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' participation, follow-up, and review, which is included in paragraph 79. The SDG framework calls on indigenous peoples and other major groups to engage actively in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, including the follow-up and review at the national level to ensure progress for indigenous peoples is reflected. It also calls on states to engage with indigenous peoples and other major groups to achieve these goals at the country level. Other goals and targets that address indigenous peoples' priorities include human rights, as the 2 previous speakers very eloquently mentioned already, including equality, participation, environmental sustainability, in other words, climate change, biodiversity, oceans, water and forests, land rights, poverty and hunger reduction, seed diversity and sustainable agriculture, access to social security, education, and overcoming discrimination, inequality, conflict. These are all goals, targets, address indigenous peoples. But what's missing? What's missing? The indigenous peoples and resource rights, specific missing pieces, SDGs. Recognition of collective rights and traditional knowledge is another missing piece. Self-determination, treaty rights, free, prior, and informed consent. Indigenous peoples must be involved monitoring and implementing the SDGs at both country and the UN levels to address these shortfalls and ensure these and other rights are protected. As to this year's UN Permanent Forum theme, taking action, Sustainable Development Goals, some will remember we were left out in the Millennium Development Goals. So we took it upon ourselves to attempt to benefit from them as Indigenous peoples and Indigenous lens. That exclusion motivated us this time to take action for the sustainable development. It was not easy. After several late-night negotiations, we are now specifically referenced 6 times, as I mentioned earlier, including political declaration, goals 2 and 4. Notwithstanding that, we did not score well. This voluntary report. Now I say that speaking about Canada. Not score well. Indeed, we were criticized for being way behind. As you all know, the Sustainable Development Goals are the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. They address the global challenges we face, including poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, peace, justice. So we as a nation, again I speak, addressing Canada, must double our efforts. SDG 16. What is the role of Indigenous peoples in the goal? Goal to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. Provide access to justice for all. Build effective, accountable, inclusive institutions, all levels, as Andrew stated in his beginning comments. First thing I believe is that we must work together. Must work together. Lasting solutions. While the task is challenging, I also believe we have a good start, an international legal framework. First reference to sustainable development is in the ILO Convention for 169. United Nations, the Organization of American States, declarations have relevant provisions, rights of Indigenous peoples. For example, in the UN Preamble paragraph 11 and 20 relevant articles, declaration, 2 American Declaration. Those are all very helpful guides to assist Indigenous peoples goals. But it's the application and implementation we must do. In this specific instance, we must ratify ILO Convention 169 that has not been ratified. Must support, endorse the OAS, Organization of American States Declaration. It's not yet been supported. Thirdly, to do these 2 things would be a giant step forward as peace, justice, strong institutions referenced these international norms and standards. Included in the laws are the peace and friendship treaties between indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations crown. These are the basis for strengthened partnerships and restoring respectful relationships, as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls to action No. 92. Others clearly outline what we need to do is put strong institutions of action behind these words. Together, must work together, and advance at the same time reconciliation. So thank you very much for the invitation to be fire keeper, I'll say, as a helper this occasion. Tradition, very important blessing, I will say, to be asked to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us, Chief Littlechild. We're most grateful for you starting a conversational fire that we will now endeavor to grow. So thank you. And now we're going to begin our panel discussion. This evening we have 4 outstanding leaders with us, and let me give each of them a brief introduction, and then we'll begin a conversation. Professor Angela Riley is an internationally respected Indigenous rights scholar who is currently Professor of Law at the University of California, Los Angeles, as well as the Director of the Native Nations Law and Policy Center. Angela is from the citizen Potawatomi Nation, where she also serves as the Chief Justice of her nation's Supreme Court. When she's not teaching, directing, or adjudicating, Angela makes time to serve as co-chair of the United Nations Indigenous Peoples Partnership Policy Board. Professor Claire Charters is a Maori scholar who serves as co-director of the Aotearoa New Zealand Center for Indigenous Peoples and the Law. She is an expert on the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the relationship between the Maori and the state legal system, and the legitimacy of Indigenous peoples' rights under international law. Claire is a member of the International Law Association Committee on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, and she's also a trustee for the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. I should add that some of her students are in attendance on this webinar, so welcome to them as well. Dr. Debby Lin is a health scientist who is originally from Pingtung, Taiwan, and is from the Amish Indigenous Peoples, Taiwan's largest indigenous tribe. Debby's research focus is on the environmental and nutritional epidemiology, and she has been a strong advocate for the promotion of international exchanges of indigenous culture. Debby works closely with the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and other global fora and venues. And finally, we have Mr. Victor Lopez Carmen, who is currently studying medicine at the Harvard Medical School, and he's a global leader in giving voice to Indigenous youth on human rights issues. Victor is a citizen of the Crow Creek Sioux tribe of South Dakota and the Yaqui tribe of Arizona in Mexico. In addition to his studies, Victor serves as co-chair of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, and recently he launched an important effort to support 7 Indigenous nations in their battle against the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome to each of our panelists, and thank you so much for joining us. So let's get right into it. I want to begin by asking each of you for a general assessment of how Indigenous peoples are doing in global affairs and initiatives. In as background, Indigenous peoples have been active in global organizations and initiatives for many decades. The 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was a big leap forward in recognizing the rights and importance of Indigenous peoples. Yet in 2000, when the Millennium Development Goals were established, as Chief Littlechild noted, Indigenous peoples were excluded from the process and were not explicitly mentioned in either the goals or the indicators. The Sustainable Development Goals, crafted in 2015, are a different story, however. Of the 17 goals and 169 targets, there are several explicit references to Indigenous peoples. In fact, more than 70 of these targets have meaningful links to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Additionally, the Sustainable Development Goals have a clear commitment to engage Indigenous communities in implementing and reviewing progress in achieving these goals. So my question to each of the panelists is very straightforward. When it comes to the treatment and inclusion of Indigenous peoples, how's the world doing? So Claire, let's begin with you.
Oh, kia ora koutou. It's wonderful to be here, and thanks so much for that, Andrew. So I guess I would focus on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples a little bit, and I think part of me feels very optimistic and positive about the ways, at least in some places around the globe, the Declaration is really influencing both state law, but also I think Indigenous law and tribal and nations law across the globe. And I think that's really powerful because of the rights to self-determination, because of rights to lands, territories, and resources. And I also am really positive about the ways that the Declaration and Indigenous people's rights generally are being recognised in places where formerly there was reluctance, and that includes in Asia. And I've been really, really delighted to hear more about developments in Taiwan, for example. But equally, jumping to the other side, I'm also a bit pessimistic and disappointed about the lack of traction that the Declaration and Indigenous people's rights generally have had in other places of the world. And that includes, for example, in recognising the need for Indigenous participation in governance, be it the international or domestic or local level. And that's done through not recognising Indigenous peoples and not facilitating or enabling Indigenous peoples to exercise self-determination and our own control over our own destinies, I guess. And then a part of me feels a bit neutral about some developments. So in the part of the world where I come from in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we increasingly see our courts referring to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And while I think that's a good thing that the Declaration is influencing state law, I'm also worried about state institutions determining what the Declaration means and being, in some places and spaces, the dominant voice in how you apply self-determination. And I think we need to be very careful as Indigenous peoples to make sure that our own voices are included in how the Declaration's interpreted and applied in reality and at the domestic level. So that's a very Declaration focus, but thanks for that, Andrew, and kia ora koutou, kia ora to my tauira. It's nice to see you here.
Thank you very much, Claire. And so, Angela, I want to turn to you. So Claire sort of painted both an optimistic yet partly pessimistic picture of how the world is doing with its treatment of Indigenous peoples. What are your views?
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think my views track Claire's to some extent, but I might be slightly more optimistic. One of the things that I have seen, and I know that everyone has seen, is that climate change is presenting an existential crisis to all of us on the planet, to two-legged and four-legged and all living things. And one thing that I have been heartened by is an increasing engagement with Indigenous peoples around issues of sustainability, environmental knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, all of those kinds of things. And at the same time that we're seeing global pressures press up against Indigenous rights, one of the places that immediately comes to mind for me is the Amazon basin, although of course we see that here in the US right now with pipelines and waste storage and other things. But there is a sense to which Indigenous voices are being included in that conversation, if for no other reason than there's a certain extent to which Indigenous peoples may be able to facilitate the continued existence of our mother, the planet, and all of us as humans here. So I do find that to be relatively optimistic. And I did want to just say one more thing, which is picking up on Claire's discussion of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We can more about this later in this conversation, but I did want to just say that we are seeing, especially here in the US, critical engagement with the UN Declaration at the tribal law level. And I've been working on a project around that, and we have produced a toolkit for tribes, and I would just, maybe I'll be able to put that in the chat for people to access. It's available online, but it is really heartening to see tribes themselves as self-governing, self-determining entities really pushing for their own rights, human rights standards in their own law.
That's very exciting news. So thank you for sharing that with us. I want to turn to a very particular segment of Indigenous peoples, and Victor, get your thoughts. And that's Indigenous youth. So Victor, how engaged are Indigenous youth in conversations that are taking place at global institutions like the UN? Has it been a struggle? What advice would you give to the institutions themselves? And then maybe importantly, it's a multi-pronged kind of question, but how do you get more Indigenous youth aware of what's happening and even more involved?
Thank you so much. Victor Tayak. Really an honor to be here with everyone. I think it's a great question. From my time at the UN working with Indigenous youth, I've seen that Indigenous youth are very passionate. They want to get involved. They want to learn how to advocate for their rights, and they want to learn from the elders who've done so much amazing groundwork and laid the groundwork down for this incredible opportunities at the UN to really make a difference and learn. I think in terms of Indigenous youth participation, once the Indigenous youth are there, it works really well, and it's really inspiring in the way that we work together, and we have our own caucus, and we come together and we make joint statements, and we teach each other, we share our culture, and we do work a lot with our elders once we're there, and it's really beautiful. I think some of the challenges is getting the youth there who aren't able to make it. For one, a lot of Indigenous youth are in school at the time. It's in April, so whether you're in the global north or the global south, usually Indigenous youth are in school at the time. So to take time off of school, whether you're in elementary or any level, it can be difficult. And a lot of Indigenous youth don't have funding to get to the United Nations. You know, we don't work. Most of us are in school, and many of us who aren't in school and we're at a certain age are working so that we can help provide for our families. And so the funding to get there, I think, would be really helpful. I think it's a voice that's needed in the UN space, and it's been fantastic to get, Indigenous youth there. But we could always use more, and a lot of Indigenous youth, as we know, Indigenous peoples are very disproportionately impacted by the economic crisis and disproportionately poorer than non-Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous youth are the same. So I think the challenge would be to get more Indigenous youth there and increase the access.
Well, I don't know how much we can do about pulling them out of school, but the funding challenge is certainly a solvable one. So I'm glad you raised these sort of very practical barriers to increased youth participation. But it sounds like when the youth are able to participate, it's really a beautiful thing. Debby, I want to turn to you. And you're passionate about environmental and nutritional epidemiology, which basically means you study how environmental exposures in food impacts human health. Now, obviously, this is a big deal to Indigenous peoples around the world, and especially Indigenous youth. How well do you think nation states are turning to Indigenous peoples for solutions or to be part of this vital conversation? And what could they be doing better?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I heard that it's great to be here. And from my own perspective, we often see that Indigenous people live in area that could potentially be easier to have higher contamination, and that is some of the area that the mainstream researchers are focusing on. We only focus on the negative that impacts Indigenous people, but oftentimes we forgot Indigenous people comes with a lot of knowledge, all traditional knowledge on food, on what to eat. The Amis people in Taiwan, we have a joke that we said, we can eat anything, like we will not die if we go into the environment. So I think currently there's a lack of attention on the knowledge and traditional power that Indigenous people can provide, especially with respect to environment and with respect to food and some of the healing that can come from nature. And I think that's something that we definitely want to call more attention on.
Great, I really appreciate that, because so often non-Indigenous peoples don't think about Indigenous peoples.
I think we've momentarily lost Andrew.
Number 16 centers on the theme of peace, justice, and strong institutions. And I want to ask particularly Angela and Claire about these last two words, strong institutions. And when most people think of strong institutions in the context of a global framework, they think of institutions at the nation state level. Yet there's been tremendous activity among Indigenous communities to build their own institutions that are both strong and effective. So Angela, I want to begin with you. What do you find most exciting about Indigenous peoples building their own institutions?
Well, I mean, I think what's most exciting, and I can speak mostly to the situation here in the United States, is just, for so long, Indigenous peoples, particularly here in the US, were driven to a point of, where our governments were criminalized, our religions were criminalized, our languages were attempted to be wiped out, our children were taken from us. Every possible mechanism that the state could use to destroy Indigenous peoples and their lifeways and their governments was basically pummeled upon us. And it didn't work. We are still here. Indigenous nations are thriving in the United States, and it's really incredible to see. And I think one of the things that I see as so remarkable about this is the extent to which Indigenous peoples and Indian nations in the US are really actively engaging in their own process of essentially uncovering and recovering their Indigenous governance institutions and putting into place what works for them as individual Indian nations. In some cases, this is in parallel to the institutional structures of the nation state of the US, and in other cases, it's a stark departure. And I think it provides all kinds of models for thinking about nation building and thinking about the engagement of the polity by Indian nations and the governments with their own people, and really thinking about things, just to give one example, given the moment that we're in the world right now, how Indigenous peoples, for example, are thinking about how they might want to recreate the relationship of policing to their own communities, or the relationship of incarceration to their own communities, focuses on restorative justice, focuses on treatment for things like drug and alcohol addiction as opposed to imprisonment. We're seeing all kinds of path marking kinds of things happening at the Indigenous nation level that I think could really inspire a larger global conversation that the larger global community could learn from.
And Angela, give us a sense of some of the institutions that Indigenous peoples might either create themselves or take over. I mean, does it always start at the constitutional level, building their own constitution or reforming their own constitution? Is it courts? Is it health systems? Or is it all of the above?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Andrew, you and I be serving on boards together and doing this work, as you know, it starts everywhere. I think some tribes are choosing to engage at the constitutional level first, re-envision their constitution, their relationship to what they consider the supreme law of their own land, whether that comes from tribal custom and tradition or somewhere else, how it's rooted in Indigenous language and lifeways and culture. So some will start at the constitutional level. Others started sort of more practically oriented ways. To what extent can they take over the institutions in Indian country that have been traditionally governed by the United States that they might be able to do a better job with? Things like health services, health clinics, child welfare, court systems, and the list goes on. So I've seen tribes sort of come at it from a lot of different directions. And many times, many success stories sort of at all levels of implementation.
That's great. Claire, let me turn to you now. In sort of building off Angela's comments, let's talk specifically about self-determination, a concept that has garnered a lot of attention in the context of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And, sort of as Angela was just mentioning, the research in the United States is clear. Self-determination is not only the morally correct policy approach, but it also works to eradicate poverty and improve socioeconomic conditions among Indigenous peoples. So why is self-determination so controversial? And what can be done to help countries see the power and promise of Indigenous self-determination?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Angela. So why is self-determination so problematic, and why? Wow, that's a big question, Andrew. But I think, and it's actually very difficult to answer on a global level, because I think each Indigenous people in each nation state has a different kind of dynamic, I think. But at heart, I think some of the reluctance to recognise Indigenous self-determination or something like sovereignty is because the nation state, the colonial state, or the sovereign state as understood, is often threatened by it, of course, right? Because this might mean some sort of sharing of power, or it might challenge the legitimacy of the colonial state, of course, to recognise Indigenous people's self-determination, that there's some competing authority, and maybe the state never acquired the authority to govern or to exercise any power, in fact, over Indigenous people. So, I mean, of course, at heart, that's politically difficult for any power. Powers, whatever form they take, institutionally, don't like giving up power, right? So I think that's one of the reasons. But going back to, I guess, tying this in with some of Angela's comments, I think what has been very powerful, at least in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is despite having no recognition formally under the New Zealand's constitution of Māori sovereignty, and we don't have this recognition of inherent sovereignty or anything. We have the state that assumes it's got 100% indivisible authority, at least that's the sort of constitutional basic structure. And while there's been some development and changes in that, I think slowly in Aotearoa and New Zealand, I think what's really inspiring is that Māori have just lived our own self-determination. I mean, sure, we would like to have more recognition of that, and we wouldn't like the state to formally stay out rather than under its own legal dialogue say that it's got some sort of authority over Māori. But that living self-determination, and it's always been part of being Māori, is that you have your own authority and your own laws, and you live by them in certain spaces and places. What I think is exciting in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is we've seen more expression of that, and more sort of audacious expression of that in ways that do challenge the state government, I think, rather than kind of happening under the radar. And I think to some extent that's been tolerated by the state, and I think that's really good, because it is constitutionally challenging at home. And I think you see similar things happening elsewhere. But yeah, that just doing it and practicing our own laws and providing for our own people, providing resources, food, as providing alternatives to criminal justice system, providing I think all of that is really exciting. And also trying to think about contemporary models of governance as well. Traditional models, of course, need to be supported, but also dynamic interesting ways in which Indigenous law can accommodate different and strong institutional structures that have nothing to do with the state.
I'm so glad you said that, because in fact you answered one of the follow-up questions I had for you, which was how important is the formal recognition of self-determination and self-governance by the nation state for Indigenous communities to move forward? And it sounds like the answer is just do it. Is that your advice?
Absolutely, I think just living it, and then also it's from, you know, where I come from, where there is no formal recognition. The more that we do it, and the less sort of challenging, not less challenging, but the less sort of, the more familiar it becomes, the easier it is to get sort of support for exercising our own self-determination. And so that's where I think you see things happening. So we'll talk about this a bit later, but in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, by Māori tribes living our own self-determination, the state can see, well, we're doing a pretty good job, and maybe it is better to stay out. And I think so. Formal recognition is important at some point. I mean, ideally in Aotearoa, we would have a pluralist structure with equal authority for Māori and the state, or something akin to that. So at some point, you're going to start push these things are going to push against each other, and there's going to be competing authority. And you do have to work that out. But yeah, I think living it is the best way to just get on with it.
That's great advice. You know, I want to turn to something that you just mentioned, and it's the crisis that has unfolded over the entire world, and that's the COVID-19 pandemic. And worldwide, there's been more than 3 million deaths, and as all of you know, Indigenous peoples have been hit terribly hard by the virus, with case rates and deaths among Indigenous peoples considerably higher than that found in the general population. But I also know that the response to the pandemic by Indigenous peoples has been quite strong in certain places. And Victor, I want to ask you, because I know this is something that you've been working on. What explains why some Indigenous communities are doing better in responding to the pandemic than others? What are some of the lessons that non-Indigenous people can learn from the Indigenous experience?
Well, in terms of why some Indigenous communities are doing better than others, I think that is entirely on the fault of the system that they are in, the country that they are in, and how well that country does at respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. In countries where, for instance, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is less respected. If you read the report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous peoples have done worse with the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of that is because these social factors, including the social determinants of health, they fall under respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. When our rights are respected, our health is much better. And that's shown across the entire world. So in conclusion, when the countries respect our rights and respect our sovereignty, we're much more capable of doing what we've always done, which is taking care of our communities.
That's great. Thank you very much. Debbie, what do you have to offer on this question about the pandemic and Indigenous response to it?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Victor has said. It's having control and having determination of our own health is a key to thrive. And a lot of the disparity that we see in COVID, it's not how people react at the pandemic, at the moment of the pandemic. It's a accumulation of historical injustice that has accumulated over time that leads to lack of resource, lack of access to healthcare, to vaccine, and to information, and to other protection, and also like the integrity of the community. Like Indigenous people, we are collective beings, and when it comes to taking care of the community, we do it together. And for example, when you think about protecting our neighbors, Indigenous people would think about how my action will influence the collective health of the community rather than just individual right. So I think that's a key factor that we should tell, like Indigenous people, there is a lot of value that we can contribute to fighting COVID rather than just treating Indigenous people as the victim.
Great, thank you. Claire, how about you? You live in New Zealand, which has been a remarkable success story thus far in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Have Maori communities played a role in the national response?
Yes and no. So absolutely, in the sense that that we've exercised our own, or different iwi or tribes have exercised their own self-determination. So, for example, some iwi closed their own borders, started providing, as riffing off also some of the earlier comments, also provided health services, provided food services for some of our elderly and so on. So those expressions, I think, of tribal authority and exercising that in the interests of protecting our communities against COVID-19. Despite New Zealand having a very, very strong leadership, I think, on COVID and going to the sort of complete sort of elimination and keep COVID out kind of strategy, Māori have been included, but to some extent on the margins, but not as much as we should have been. And there's been some new, in response to the COVID crisis, new legislation has been passed and so on, and Māori voices weren't included in that as they should have been. And for example, that has meant that there is now a law that essentially permits warrantless searches of marae, which are our sort of own places, or traditional meeting houses, I guess. And that's problematic. And also the key issue that we have at the moment with vaccine rollout is that the government's really reluctant to recognise that Māori should be a priority group. That as Māori, as Indigenous peoples, our health statistics are much worse. In fact, the worst in the country. And we live in multi-generational housing, and our risks are much higher. So despite sort of recognising that those are issues, haven't prioritised Māori in the way that we think that they should. And I think that that's partly because there's such sensitivity about the vaccine rollout and who gets it first, if you like. And I think there's a general acceptance that New Zealand we can wait to some extent, right? Like that we're not the top of the list globally, and nor should we be, because we're pretty safe and we're living free of COVID. But once we do start that, then I think there has to be a recognition that Māori are really the most vulnerable in the country, but there's this reluctance to do it because it's so contentious, and people will argue that's inequality and things like that. But obviously, that's not quite right. So,
great. Well, thank you for sharing those perspectives, Angela. A few minutes ago, you described what could only be, well, I guess it could only be described as a renaissance that's occurring among American Indian nations and tribes that are just taking over services, really making good on this notion of self-determination and governing themselves with their own institutions. And so, as it relates to COVID-19, I guess from a nation building perspective, what are you seeing American Indian nations doing to prepare for the next pandemic? And what's your confidence level that American Indian nations will be better able to respond to the next public health crisis?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, everyone knows the situation in the United States was very bad, and it was worse in Indian country. There were Indian reservations that were completely ravaged by COVID. And one of the things that happened is when the pandemic was in full on, this was, prior to the election, the last presidential election. And my sister is a nurse at our tribal health clinic. And at a time when, New York workers couldn't get PPE and all of these other things, our own clinic already had isolation tents set up and protocols in place and all kinds of we were so far ahead of the United States in terms of taking care of our own people. And I think that's one of the things that Indigenous peoples have really working to their advantage is there's such a commitment. I mean, the government and the people are the same people. You know, they're all your family. You're all related to each other. So the incentives to actually really protect your people and not just certain segments of your population is inherent in who we are. And I think tribes did a remarkable job with the tools that they had, and some of them had very few tools in really stopping the spread of the disease. And I think the thing that was so heartening to me, because in contrast to what Claire was saying, in the United States, you know, tribes did get their own supplies of the vaccine to disseminate. And it was so heartening to me to see our tribe vaccinating our tribal members so quickly that we then were able to vaccinate any tribal members in the area, and were then able to vaccinate anybody who wanted to get vaccinated when the states were just sort of creeping along in their rollouts. And that just to me was, you know, it's so ironic, of course, that our communities were devastated by disease, and now we're the ones who are vaccinating our non-Indigenous neighbors to keep them safe from COVID. So I think part of it is an investment in an Indigenous worldview. That's an investment in our people, and hopefully an Indigenous worldview that I think is shared amongst Indigenous peoples in the world, that we want to be good neighbors. You know, we are all in this together. We are all related in one way or another. And I think that Indigenous perspective is partially what will help us to be adequately prepared for, unfortunately, the next pandemic, which will come.
Thank you. That's a great insight. I want to touch on a subject that I know all of you think very carefully about, and that subject is shifting demographics. One of the phenomena we see among Indigenous nations and communities is urbanization, and we see this around the world as well. It's not just limited to Indigenous peoples. But Indigenous peoples are moving into the cities at a very rapid pace. And, you know, in the United States alone, about 2/3 of all Native people now live in urban areas. And so, Claire, let me begin with you. What, as you think about this question of changing demographics and urbanization that's taking place at a global scale, what are the implications for nation states as they implement either the Sustainable Development Goals or the UN Declaration?
Well, it's interesting that you raise that, because Māori are a highly urbanized, if you want to call it people. We are different peoples, but highly urbanized, and that's in response to, I guess, policies around the post-war World War II policies, 40s, 50s. So we are highly urbanized, and I think it's interesting to see that happening on a more global scale. And tribes and peoples, but also with the other peoples that are engaged, that are in the urban environment. You know, I think there's lots of issues to raise, sort of around how you exercise authority in those urban settings where you might not have a territorial space, right? So whether you have sort of personal jurisdiction or not, or I just think that there's lots of challenges in urbanization. I think that the interesting thing about Māori demographics is, while being highly urbanized, at least statistically, and many of our children today don't know where they come from, what tribe that they come from. That is an unfortunate reality. But there's been a lot of effort, I think, on tribes to ensure that the urbanized Māori are reconnecting and making that possible through internet, through saying, come along, we're having these sort of open events. If you think you might have what we call whakapapa or genealogy back to this tribe, come home. Don't be shy or embarrassed with whakamā. And so I think maintaining that connection too with your traditional territories and traditional structures and things is really important too. I should add that it's very different from where you come from in the country, and how close you are to these centres or not, or how strong the traditional governance is. So each place is very different, and you can't have a one-size-fits-all response to urbanisation. One thing I would say demographically, so Māori, we make up sort of somewhere between, depending on which statistic you read, but sort of 14 and 17% of the New Zealand population. We're expected to be a lot higher in 80 years or so, many tens higher. So that's going to be an interesting thing for Aotearoa New Zealand.
Great, thank you. Debbie, I know you have some thoughts on this. This falls right into your wheelhouse of research interests. So what are your thoughts? Does urbanization and other demographic shifts, does that present an opportunity or challenge to, say, the preservation of native foods or indigenous land management? Debbie, you may be on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I want to echo what Claire said. I think it's really important. Yeah, as the demographic shift, our blood is still flowing, the indigenous culture is flowing, our connection is still there. And when indigenous people are starting to build community within the city, one of the first challenge we face is space. Where do we get together? Where is our home? Where is our Malay in Mali? And where can people come and just be free and connect to the environment? I want to make an example. So for my tribe, and I live in the city as well, and there are a lot of I.P.C people living in the city. Originally, we don't have a lot of place to gather, so we gather in park, like public park, and when we see some vegetation in the park, we know like which one is edible. But you know, like that will cause a problem when it's a public space. So over time, we actually so some of the indigenous elders, they start to volunteer and donate their land, their farm for indigenous people to gather. And in that land, when they have the space, they can foster their community, the passing of the language and the culture to the younger generation. And I think that's really important, where the large institution can step in. Because as the process of development, I think it's important for a large institution to recognize that historically they have been taking advantage of indigenous people, or like the nature where it was indigenous traditional territory, and which caused some injustice in the advantage and the how much wealth that different group has gathered. I think it's important for more large institutions to step up and provide resource for indigenous people who they can access and have determination on how to utilize those resources.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. Victor, I want to give you the last word on this topic. So what does this mean for the youth? So, for example, do you worry about sort of brain drain or too much indigenous youth talent leaving their traditional homelands for either school or work? Is that a big issue? How do you think about these issues?
Yeah, with brain drain, I think, you know, it's something you think about. It's something that I feel like we shouldn't put on the youth. I want indigenous youth to be able to, you know, do whatever they want to do, whatever they dream of, and feel like they can do anything they want. But also understand that a lot of indigenous youth, you know, growing up, I felt a lot of it was like success often equated with success in the Western world, and leaving and doing big things. And you know, I think we have to make sure that indigenous youth know that they can be successful at home too. And you know, doing big things can mean many different things. You know, it can mean being president, or it can mean, you know, being an electrician on the reservation and caring for your family, or you know, going into cultural roles in the community. And yeah, I think there should be an obligation on the countries to, you know, reinvest in indigenous communities, so that for the indigenous youth to pursue Western education, for instance, that the country should invest so that there are jobs available in community for them to come back, because you can't just apologize. You have to reinvest to create solutions. And I think that obligation is on the countries who've disenfranchised us, to help, you know, give us funding and in a sense reparations for indigenous communities to decide how they want to run themselves and giving Indigenous youth more opportunities to both leave if they want and to come back, and essentially just to be free on our own land. I think there's a beauty in the fact that many of our communities were free to roam on the land, and we should still be free to roam on our lands today, whether it's in a city or in reservation or remote. And that pressure should not be put on the Indigenous youth to feel like, oh, if I leave, I'm failing. If I stay, I'm not enough. And I think much of that pressure is because of this system that we're in, and how far the countries have to go in respecting our rights.
Understood. Thank you. That's a very candid response, which I'm sure our audience appreciates. I want to begin to wrap up this panel session with an easy question. I'm just kidding. It's not going to be an easy question, but the question is very straightforward. And it's this: what's the one thing you want everyone who's listening and watching right now to understand about the subject of Indigenous peoples and their role in charting the future of the world? What's the one key message you want to highlight? And if you can keep your sort of responses under 30 seconds, that's great, because people can remember it. Let's start with you, Angela.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, I'm going to quote Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We are still here. And I think the one thing that I would want people to know is that it's always in the interest of powerful elites to pit people who have the least against each other to keep power entrenched. But it doesn't have to be, Indigenous peoples winning doesn't have to mean other people losing. We are all part of a global community together. And I think we've seen remarkable strides in what's happened in Indigenous rights just in my lifetime. And I really am optimistic that that's only going to continue to improve, in part by us believing in ourselves and being good neighbors to others. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Let's turn back to you, Victor. What's your closing message?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, I think to prioritize the future, prioritize Indigenous youth, and invest in Indigenous youth, because I think so we can go back to our communities and just be free. Just help Indigenous youth so that we can be whole.
Great, thank you. Debbie, let's turn to you. What's the one message you want our audience to understand?
Yes, I want to share that when Indigenous people thrive, the entire world will be a better place, because we see the earth as our mother nature. So we will be a good caretaker for our earth and also for everyone in this world.
Great, that's an important message about stewardship. Thank you. And then lastly, Claire, what's the one central message you want to convey?
Thanks, Andrew. I think it would be tino rangatiratanga, also known as mana motuhake, or self-determination or sovereignty. Yeah, we've got we should be able to control our own destinies, and I think that plays into all the other messages, and that means that we need to practice and live our own authority over ourselves. And there's lots that people can learn from us, and there's lots that we can learn from others. But yeah,
great, I appreciate that.
Self-determination.
Thank you. So, Chief Littlechild, you've been patiently listening to our experts and talking about a whole range of issues, from self-determination to nation building and institution building, the efforts and advocacy of Native youth, to land systems and lots of things in between. We were very fortunate to have you start the proverbial fire for us in this webinar. And I hope that we built upon that fire and fanned it a little bit more. What are some of your sort of final thoughts you'd like to share with us? You may be on mute.
First of all, I want to thank all the amazing information the panelists gave us, shared with us. If I could make a thread of what I heard, I'll start with back in 1923 when we had a voice. Now have a voice. Heard some of it tonight, today, this morning, wherever you are. So now we have a voice, and the message from that voice is to stay optimistic. And I really agree with Claire that we have to do the interpreting rights. With that, it's the comment about tribal laws, courts, tribal courts, tribal laws. That level is where the interpretation could and should happen. Contributions that we can make as Indigenous peoples, traditional wisdom for healing. Effective institutions. Glad you added that, effective institutions, because it draws out another solution for us. That was the focus on constitutions. A difficult area of self-determination is not really that difficult, because as we just heard, just do it. And we also heard, do it together. So I think those are very, very encouraging and important messages. With COVID, I think we were a little bit amiss by globe not recognizing we have traditional medicines that have helped us with that challenges in the urban areas. But let me close with this. I said this before at the UN 50th anniversary of Universal Declaration on Human Rights. When Indigenous peoples win, the world wins. I kind of, it's the first key message. When Indigenous peoples' world views respected, laws are respected, our youth are prioritized, and contributions truly felt the world as they go forward in sustainable development. Because those are Indigenous solutions on that path. So thank you very much to the panel members. Thank you to the hosts. Thank you, Andrew. Last word, if I say. Keep the fire going.
Those are good words of wisdom. Thank you, Chief. I want to have some closing remarks from Deputy Minister Gadu. Deputy Minister, thank you so much for your keynote remarks. It gave us so much to think about. And as you reflect upon the conversation that has taken place since your remarks, what are your thoughts and any advice for us as we go forward?
For a member of the United Nations, making it difficult for us to speak up for our issues in the UN. However, every year in the past, our delegations of Taiwanese indigenous peoples have participated in the UNPFII to speak for Taiwan. Our delegation also shared Taiwanese indigenous people's situation with the world through meetings arranged by the TACO in New York, so as to build a connection with the world. In today's webinar, we are honored to exchange ideas with indigenous leaders, scholars, and experts from all over the world on the promotion of indigenous rights. I also hope to continue our friendship and hope that in the near future, I can invite you to visit Taiwan so that we could have face-to-face conversation and work together to address the challenges faced by the indigenous peoples. Eventually, we are practice the spirit of the UNTRIP and implement the SDGs of the UN. So, lastly, thank you for enjoying us today. May you be healthy today and every day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, as a way to conclude this just wonderful webinar, I want to, on behalf of our dignitaries and speakers, I want to express our appreciation to you, our audience, for joining us for this important webinar. Special thanks to our host, the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in New York, as well as our distinguished speakers and panelists. I know our host is looking forward to holding another session similar to this, maybe on a slightly different topic, but again, an important subject of Indigenous peoples next year in New York, and we will welcome all of you to hopefully be able to do this in person the next time we gather. In conclusion, I hope you enjoyed this broad-ranging discussion and leave this webinar more knowledgeable and ideally more inspired to make a difference in whatever way you're able. I look forward to continuing this important conversation in the future. And until then, I wish you peace, safety, wellness, and much happiness. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.